Thank you, Tim, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. 100 years ago this Sunday, on November the 4th, 1912, Bertrand Russell delivered the inaugural address to the Aristotelian Society, its 34th session. It was Russell's second year as president. His lecture, you didn't have to deal with these things. His lecture, as you can see here, was entitled On the Notion of Cause, and as the proceedings there note, a discussion followed in which a number of members took part. Outside the Aristotelian Society, the discussion continues to this day. Russell's paper remains both influential and controversial, as we're going to see. And it's widely known as the source of one of the most famous lines in 20th century philosophy. Here's the first page, and here down at the very bottom is the line in question. The law of causation, Russell declares, like much that passes muster among philosophers, is a relic of a bygone age, surviving, like the monarchy, only because it's erroneously supposed to do no harm. Now, as it happens, this is really the one piece of Russell's entire philosophical output with which my own work connects directly, and certainly the only one where I'd make any claim to advancing the matters under discussion. So I wanted to take advantage of this happy coincidence to use my own inaugural lecture to the chair that now bears Russell's name, to celebrate the centenary of this famous paper, the upcoming centenary, and to talk about what its conclusions look like, at least from my point of view, with the benefit of a century's hindsight. As we're going to see, it's a story with a lot of Cambridge connections, and indeed I'm not the first occupant of this chair to mention Russell's paper in an inaugural lecture. Elizabeth Anscombe does so in her piece Causality and Determination from 1971. Anscombe says, Russell wrote of the notion of cause, or at any rate of the law of causation, and he seemed to feel the same way about cause itself, but like the British monarchy, it had been allowed to survive because it had been erroneously thought to do no harm. In a destructive essay of great brilliance, Anscombe says he argued that upon examination, the concepts of determination and of invariable succession of like objects upon like turn out to be empty. They do not differentiate between any conceivable course of things and any other. Now, my concerns this evening are somewhat different from Anscombe's, but I will follow her in one respect, that is, in interpreting Russell's target broadly rather than narrowly. As you see here, Anscombe takes it to include cause as well as the law of causation. I'm going to take it to include a broad class of counterfactual judgments, that is, judgments of the form, if A had not happened, B would not have happened. Now, I don't suggest that Russell himself took his thesis to extend this far, but the history of the subject since Russell's time has shown that such counterfactuals are very closely connected, not only to causation in general, but also to some of the specific issues about causation at the core of Russell's great paper. One of Russell's key arguments concerns the so-called time asymmetry of causation, the fact that effects are supposed to occur later than their causes, or at least not earlier than their causes. Russell says that there's nothing to ground such a difference between past and future in fundamental physics. More recent writers have noted that there's a similar time asymmetry in counterfactual reasoning. If the lights had failed at the beginning of this lecture, the proceedings since that moment would have been different, presumably. I might not have progressed this far in the talk, for example. But events before the failure of the lights would have been just the same, or so our intuitions tell us. David Lewis called this the asymmetry of counterfactual dependence, and proposed to use it to explain the asymmetry of causation that Russell had taken to be missing in fundamental physics. If we're attracted by that thought, then a good question is where the time asymmetry of counterfactual dependence comes from, if Russell's right and there isn't anything suitable in fundamental physics. I'll come back to that briefly later on. But for the moment, I've mentioned it to make the point that we can't sensibly discuss the issues raised by Russell's paper without broadening the scope in this way to include counterfactuals. But broadening the scope raises the stakes. Russell seems to be suggesting that abandoning talk of causality would be practical as well as desirable, much as abandoning the monarchy might be. Some planning, a few days of mild confusion perhaps, and it will be done. Indeed, Russell seems to have thought that modern physicists, vanguard of this metaphysical revolution, had already made the change. So here he says, all philosophers of every school imagine that causation is one of the fundamental axioms or postulates of science, yet oddly enough in the advanced sciences, such as gravitational astronomy, the word cause never occurs. Russell then goes out to single out for criticism his former teacher, James Ward, who you see here, who was actually the very first holder of this chair, its inauguree, so to speak. Russell says that Ward makes the fact that the advanced sciences don't mention causation the fact that the advanced sciences don't mention causation a ground for complaint against physics. The business of science, Ward apparently thinks, says Russell, should be the discovery of causes, yet physics never even seeks them. And then Russell goes on, to me it seems that philosophy ought not to assume such legislative functions, and that the reason why physics has ceased to look for causes is that in fact there are no such things. And after that we get the famous line about the monarchy. But if Russell's right about physics, the idea that we could dispense with talk of causality, much as we might dispense with the monarchy, still seems wildly unrealistic. And the point's even more obvious when we notice the way in which counterfactuals are liable to be swept up in the same net. For my text at this point, I'm going to take some wise and unexpectedly topical words I once heard attributed to the distinguished American philosopher Jerry Fodor, who you see here. Fodor's words take the form of a riddle. He asks, why is Manhattan real estate so expensive? And goes on to answer, you're paying for all those counterfactuals. You all know why this is topical. Here's somebody last Monday night demonstrating that New Yorkers waste no opportunity to look for new counterfactuals, whatever the adversity. But imagine the consequences if Fodor's news that the price of real estate depends on counterfactuals and Russell's news that there's no such thing as counterfactuals. Imagine what happens if that news leaks out at the same time. The value of your apartment depends on its counterfactuals, but Bertrand Russell no less says there ain't no counterfactuals. So the whole Manhattan market is a gigantic Ponzi scheme, built not on sand, not even on paper, but literally on nothing. It's unthinkable. And literally so, perhaps, if counterfactual thought is to be imagined groundless, and yet we need a counterfactual to ask the question, as in my title. Now, at this point, we might defend Russell by suggesting that his real target is more modest. His view about the word cause, as he puts it, is that it is, quote, so inextricably bound up with misleading associations as to make its complete extrusion from the philosophical vocabulary desirable, and that there are no causes at the fundamental level in physics. But that's compatible, perhaps, with recognizing a non-fundamental role for causal vocabulary, and counterfactuals too, in non-fundamental parts of physics and everyday life. Provided such a role could be found, we then might save the real estate market, indeed the finance system itself, for what is money except a convenient form of exchangeable counterfactuals, without treating talk of causation and counterfactuals as tracking some deep God-given feature of the furniture of reality. After all, remember the first three laws of real estate: location, location, location. They surely survive the discovery that there's no such thing as absolute space. So we can defend Russell by taking him, like Hume before him perhaps, to be proposing only a kind of armchair revolution. He wants to banish causation from the kind of serious conversation that goes on around the Great Court in Trinity and similar venues elsewhere, if such there be, without banishing it from the streets. But even this modest... Okay, so that's a kind of ironic reading of what Russell's on about in this paper. But even this kind of modest armchair revolution seems to be undone by a famous paper by Nancy Cartwright from 1979, her Causal Laws and Effective Strategies. Cartwright begins in this paper with Russell's distinction between symmetric laws of association, on the one hand, the kind of Humean regularities that Russell thinks that modern physics actually offers us, and the asymmetric causal laws that Russell thinks we need to dispense with, at least in the armchair. Cartwright notes that Russell argues for two conclusions. In her words, firstly, that laws of association are all the laws there are, and secondly, that causal principles cannot be derived from the causally symmetric laws of association. And she goes on to argue in support of this Russell's second claim, but against the first claim. That is, she agrees that causal laws can't be reduced to laws of association, as she puts it, but maintains that they cannot be done away with. Her argument here is that causal laws are needed to ground an important distinction between effective and ineffective strategies, a distinction that she illustrates with a number of examples, one of them turning on a letter she says she received from an insurance company. This is a quote from the letter. The letter says, "It simply wouldn't be true to say, Nancy L.D. Cartwright, that if you own a TIAA life insurance policy, you'll live longer. But it is a fact, nonetheless, that persons insured by the TIAA do enjoy longer lifetimes on the average than persons insured by commercial insurance companies that serve the general public." And this is an insurance company that sells insurance to academics. And it's easy to see why it's true, because perhaps academics tend to have healthier lifestyles. We'll see what they're trying to do. They're trying to get us, the insurance company is trying to get Cartwright, the last person they should have picked, to engage in a piece of fallacious reasoning. Anyway, Cartwright argues that the objective fact reported in the first line of this letter, that is, that buying life insurance from this company would not be an effective strategy for living longer, depends on the causal rather than the merely probabilistic facts about the world. Probabilistically speaking, there is this correlation between buying life insurance from these people and living longer. But Cartwright argues the objectivity of strategies requires the objectivity of causal laws. In other words, causal laws can't be done away with, for they needed to ground the distinction between effective strategies and ineffective ones. The difference between the two depends on the causal laws of our universe and on nothing weaker. Well, commenting on this famous argument of Cartwright's in a recent survey paper, the American philosopher Hartree Field concludes, "This makes a compelling case against Russell's views that we should do without causal notions." But Cartwright herself draws a much stronger conclusion, a kind of causal hyperrealism. She holds that the causal fact that the force on an object makes the object go faster is not reducible to Newton's second law, nor to other non-causal facts either, such as the equations of energy flow. Such equations are just further parts of fundamental physics, which Cartwright regards as laws of association rather than as causal. Rather, the claim that a force on an object makes the object go faster states a further truth about the world that physics leaves out. This is Field's gloss of Cartwright's position. Evidently, there's supposed to be some sort of causal fluid that's not taken account of in the equations of physics, but just how it is that we're supposed to have access to its properties, I'm not sure, says Field. Now, Field himself finds this kind of hyperrealism, as he calls it, unpalatable, but he recognises the importance of Cartwright's challenge. He says, "Despite the implausibility of the hyperrealist picture, we have a problem to solve. The problem of reconciling Cartwright's points about the need of causation in the theory of effective strategy with Russell's points about the limited role of causation in physics. This is probably the central problem in the metaphysics of causation," Field concludes. And I think he's right, except that I would say that it's one of two central problems. The other one being the problem that Russell notices of the time asymmetry of causation, especially of the time asymmetry of causation in the light of the fact that fundamental physics is essentially time relative. Accounting for the time asymmetry of causation, is a further difficulty for the hyperrealist view, But it's a problem for all views, including views which want to regard causation as something relatively non-fundamental. So let's now turn to what Russell himself says about this issue of the timely symmetry of causation. I think Russell's treatment of the problem is important more because he sees that there is a problem there than because he provides any satisfactory solution or dissolution of the problem. Let's have a look at some extracts from the central passage. This is from On the Notion of Cause. Russell puts his cards on the table straight away in this passage. He says, we all regard the past as determined simply by the fact that it has happened. But for the accident that memory works backwards and not forwards, we should regard the future as equally determined by the fact that it will happen. In other words, Russell is claiming there's no real distinction between past and future. But an accident about us, the fact that memory works backwards and not forwards, tricks us into thinking that there is. Well, he then counters his suggestion with a plausible objection. He says, but we're told you cannot alter the past, while you can to some extent alter the future. So there still seems to be a difference there, a difference between past and future. In reply to this, Russell makes 2 points. The first is that while it's true that you cannot make the past other than it was, as he puts it, this is just a matter of logic, and the same is true with respect to the future. The second point, acknowledging, I think, that the first hasn't got to the heart of the matter, introduces what turns out to be an important link between what we think we can influence and what we can know. So Russell says, if you happen to know the future, e.g. in the case of a forthcoming eclipse, it's just as useless to wish it different as to wish the past different. His self-scripted opponent does quite a good job of getting things back on track, I think. But it will be rejoined, Russell says, our wishes can cause the future sometimes to be different from what it would have been if they did not exist. Notice there's a counterfactual there. And that they can have no such effect upon the past. Even though we often don't know about the past, it would have been helpful to add, I think. And I think at this point Russell loses his grip on the force of his opponent's argument. What he says is just this. He says, this again is a mere tautology, an effect being defined as something subsequent to its cause. Obviously we can have no effect upon the past. But in response to this, we can just give Russell the terms cause and effect, defined in this way, and press the original objection as the question as to why it never makes sense to act for or to wish for, as Russell says, ends which, while not effects of our actions, being ruled out as such by this definition, because they lie in the past, are nevertheless desirable from our point of view. So why is it useless to do something now to ensure that my ticket was the winning ticket in a lottery drawn yesterday, for example, if I don't yet know that it's not? Call this the problem of the time asymmetry of deliberation. It arises because it seems to only make sense to deliberate with respect to the future, not with respect to the past. And Russell doesn't really get this problem in focus, I think. You can't avoid the question by saying that an end for which we deliberate or act is by definition an effect of our action, because then you'd have two definitions of effect in play, and you'd need to explain why they line up. And that's just the original problem. Okay, so I think there's something important that Russell misses here. And then he sums up as he sees things. He says, the facts seem to be merely one, that wishing generally depends upon ignorance and is therefore commoner in regard to the future than in regard to the past. And that where a wish concerns the future, it and its realization very often form a practically independent system. That is, many wishes regarding the future are realized. But there seems to be no doubt that the main difference in our feelings arises from the fact that the past, but not the future, can be known by memory. So again, there's this idea that the apparent difference stems from something in us. It stems from this fact that we remember the past, but not the future. So I want to emphasize 3 points about Russell's discussion here. First, as I just said, he's trying to explain the apparent time asymmetry of causal dependence as the product of a difference in us, rather than a fundamental difference in reality. And as I'll explain, I think he's right about that. He's got the wrong difference. He's got the wrong thing in us, but he's right about where the source of the difference is. The difference he picks concerns memory, but it's doubtful whether that can do the trick. It doesn't draw a clean enough line between past and future, because we remember rather little of the past and know some of the future by other means. And he already has on the table the idea that the business of the realization of our wishes, as he rather quaintly puts it, is important in explaining the illusion of asymmetry. Although hampered by the thought that it's all about memory, he doesn't get very far with this idea. But that positions us for the next step in the story, which belongs to perhaps the greatest of all these early 20th century Cambridge giants, Frank Ramsey. The step in question occurs in Ramsey's very late paper, General Propositions of Causality, which survives as a rough 30-page manuscript dated September 1929, so just about 4 months before Ramsey's tragically early death at the age of 26. About 2/3 of the way through this paper, so here we've got, I think it's page 19, 20, and 21 or something like that, and starting from the bottom of this page here, Ramsey turns to the issues of the difference between past and future and the direction of causality. Then in a few short paragraphs, just the remaining 2 pages you see there, he dissects his way to the core of the problem and shows us what it takes to lie at its heart. And in my view, this is one of the most insightful passages, not merely in 20th century philosophy, but in all of philosophy. In fact, I think that given the centrality of the issues at stake here, that is causality, the direction of time, and the location in these respects of the cut between what properly lies in the world and what comes from us, I think it has some claim to be a significant landmark in the history of human thought as a whole. But as usual, Ramsey's here too brisk for most philosophers, as Huw said about a different piece of Ramsey in his own Inaugural Lecture in 1988. And unusually, I think, Ramsey doesn't quite get everything right here. This is just the back of the envelope version, as you can see. But he does give us an answer to both the puzzles we have on the table at this point, that is Field's puzzle and the puzzle about the time asymmetry of causation. So I'm going to give you the core of the relevant passage and then highlight the key points that I think it contains. Ramsey says, "It is, it seems, a fundamental fact that the future is due to the present, but the past is not. What does this mean? It's not clear, and if we try to make it clear, it turns into nonsense or a definition. What then do we believe about the future that we do not believe about the past? The past we think is settled. If this means more than that it is past, it might mean that it is settled for us, that any present event is irrelevant to the probability for us of any past event. But that's plainly untrue," he says. "What is true is this, that any possible present," he first writes action and then crosses it out and writes volition, "any present volition of ours is for us irrelevant to any past event. To another or to ourselves in the future, it can serve as a sign of the past. But to us now, what we do affects only the probability of the future." This seems to me to be the root of the matter, Ramsey says. That I cannot affect the past is a way of saying something quite clearly true about my degrees of belief. Again, from the situation when we are deliberating, seems to me to arise the general difference of cause and effect. We are then engaged not on disinterested knowledge or classification, to which this difference is utterly foreign, but on tracing the different consequences of our possible actions, which we naturally do in sequence forward in time, proceeding from cause to effect, not from effect to cause. We can produce A or A prime, which produces B or B prime, which, etc. The probabilities of A and B are mutually dependent, but we come to A first from our present volition. In a sense, my present action is an ultimate and the only ultimate contingency. Okay, well, as you can see, it's brisk and dense. So let me outline some of the ideas that I think are there in this passage. The first thing that Ramsey's suggesting is that causation, especially the asymmetry of causation, the difference between cause and effect, needs to be understood by thinking about, as he puts it, the situation when we are deliberating. So it needs to be understood in terms of human agency. And this is an idea that turns up in later writers, including at least three with Cambridge connections. The first of these three was Douglas Gasking, who was a student here in the late 30s and later a lecturer at the University of Melbourne, who defends the idea in a wonderful paper in Mind in 1955. The second was G.H. von Wright, who was briefly Wittgenstein's successor in this chair, who defended such a view in the 1970s, a long time after he'd left Cambridge. In Oxford, Collingwood had defended something similar already in the 1940s. But as far as I know, none of these writers recognise that Ramsey was onto the idea before them, nor gets anywhere close to the insights that connect Ramsey's version of the view to these issues raised by Russell's paper. Considerably later, in the early 90s, I also defended a version of this agency view, both in joint work with my Australian colleague Peter Menzies, who is here tonight, and elsewhere. And this time Ramsey did get a mention, as did issues about the time asymmetry of causation and Cartwright's challenge to Russell. And more recently still, the idea that causation needs to be understood in terms of manipulation, as people now say, has been very prominent over the past decade or so, thanks to the work of the philosopher Jim Woodward and the computer scientist Judea Pearl, among others. But Ramsey was the very first, as far as I know. So that's the first idea, that causation needs to be understood in terms of agency. Then there's this much more specific thing at the heart of what Ramsey's offering us here. It's the idea that probability properly looks different from an agent's perspective. Ramsey's key insight is that agents are epistemically special. Probability judgments are properly different from an agent's first-person point of view than from a third-person point of view, even that of the same agent at other times. Ramsey puts this initially as the claim that our own present volitions are, for us, probabilistically independent of any past event. He doesn't actually tell us why this is so, though he does give us a hint at the end when he says, my present action is an ultimate and the only ultimate contingency. But what he has in mind is a generalization of a familiar point about how knowledge and free choice conflict. Well, it's now a familiar point, though perhaps it wasn't when Ramsey was writing. It doesn't make any sense to take yourself to be choosing between options, one of which you know to obtain. Remember Russell's example of the eclipse, known in advance. And the point emerges in the oddity of saying something like, I know I'll vote for Obama, but I'm still making up my mind. You take away with one hand the authority you bestow with the other, much as in the paradox associated with G.E. Moore, when you say P, but I don't believe that P. Again, it's this thing of bestowing authority and taking it away. Ramsey generalizes this point from knowledge to credence so that it becomes the claim that an agent cannot take herself to have evidence about what she's going to do as she deliberates. Deliberation screens prediction, as some more recent writers have put the point. So from the agent's point of view, her contemplative action must be regarded as probabilistically independent of anything that she does know at present, even if other people, or she herself at other times, could legitimately take something of that kind as evidence about her choice, or vice versa. And in my view, this is the key to solving Field's puzzle. The differences Cartwright rightly points to between the probabilities we get from laws of association on the one hand, and the probabilities associated with what we take to be causal dependencies on the other, are precisely the differences induced by the specialness of agency in the sense noticed by Ramsey. Cartwright is quite right in thinking that we can't explain effective strategy in terms of the former, but wrong to think that we need causal laws out there in the world to give us the latter. On the contrary, as I think Ramsey first saw, it's the other way around. The specialness of the agent's perspective grounds our talk of causation. This leaves the problem of the time asymmetry of causation, and here I think Ramsey is at least looking in the right direction, saying that it depends on, quote, tracing the consequences of our possible actions, which we naturally do in sequence forward in time, as he puts it. Now, since Ramsey has already appealed to the idea that there are no such dependencies between our present actions certain events in the past, the qualification naturally is, in a sense, unneeded. If Ramsey's right, then there are no dependencies except forward in time. So imagine turtles hatching on an east-facing beach. Is it any surprise that their journey takes them asymmetrically to the east? No, for there are no routes to the west from their point of view. Still, the term naturally is useful in another sense. It reminds us that we're appealing to a feature of our natures, a universal feature for us, albeit perhaps a contingent one. As structures in space-time, we human agents all share a common temporal orientation. Imagine depicting our deliberative lives on a space-time map with a little arrow connecting each instance of deliberation to its associated action where there is one. For us, all these little arrows point in the same direction, from past to future, as we normally put it. Or, to go back to these turtles, think of yourself as a beach and of your own plans and deliberations as the little turtles that hatch on that beach. What's true is not only that all plans hatch in the same direction on each beach individually, but also that all the beaches we know of face in the same direction in a temporal sense. It's an interesting question whether there could be creatures elsewhere whose beaches faced in the other direction, whose plans hatched from future to past by our lights. And the answer is probably yes, in my view, so long as they're far enough away in space-time to live in a region with low entropy in what we'd call the future rather than low entropy in what we'd call the past. But that's a very long story. The point is that universality among us, individually and collectively, is quite enough to explain our sense that the direction of causation is an a priori matter. It is a priori if you're built the way that we are built, if you're an east-facing beach, so to speak, and if talk of causation depends on agency in the sense that Ramsey suggests. Lastly, then, the question is to whether and why the past is off limits. In making agency central in this way, in spotting the special character of the agent's epistemic perspective, and in seeing the work it can do in giving us an account of the difference between cause and effect, I think Ramsey gets much further than Russell. But there's one respect in which Russell still outdoes him, in my view. Ramsey actually gives us no reason at all why the epistemic bifurcation he identifies, the split between things for which our present volition can account as evidence and things for which it can't, should line up neatly with the past-future distinction. He asserts confidently that it does, or at least that the entire past lies on the latter side of the line, when he says, what is true is this, that any possible present volition of ours is for us irrelevant to any past event. But he offers no argument at this point, or explanation of the fact in question, if it is a fact. And Russell at least has a punt at it, associating it with the fact that the past but not the future can be known by memory. Now, I think this part of the puzzle wasn't properly sorted out until the 1960s, when Michael Dummett pointed out that one could quite coherently take oneself to affect the past, that is, in Ramsey's terms, take one's present volitions to be relevant to some past event, so long as one didn't take oneself to be able to know about the relevant part of the past before one acted. Dummett points out that the knowledge condition might coherently be held to fail, so there might be past events of which we thought that we couldn't have knowledge, at least at present, even in principle. If so, then it isn't incoherent to think that we might affect them by bringing about some state of affairs in the future with which they in turn are reliably correlated. So our initial action still has to lie in the future. That's the point above about the turtles needing to swim east away from the beach. But in Dummett's picture, our influence can then zigzag back into the past, much as turtles might swim west if gaps or inlets in the beach permitted it. Not exactly what these ones are doing. It's very hard to find pictures of the turtles that left the beach. In this respect, I think that Ramsey misses something important. He's right about the character of the difference between cause and effect, but wrong about how it needs to line up with the distinction between past and future. Dummett shows how it might be false that, as Ramsey puts it, any possible present volition of ours is for us irrelevant to any past event. Now, Dummett's own interest here in these questions was a little bit esoteric. He was interested in the question of the efficacy of retrospective prayer. But I think his ideas have a much more down-to-earth application. in the case of quantum mechanics. The reason we haven't noticed the gaps in the beach in that case being that they're so small, as it were. Now, this is admittedly not a popular view, and again, I'm afraid I don't have time to explain it here. But I would like to put on record the view that the reason it's remained unpopular, at least in part, is because people who think about such things are unaware of the deep insight of Ramsey's view of causation, that it's the agent who's in the driver's seat in determining the direction of causation in nature, insofar as there is such a thing, not the other way around. Or if they are aware of that, then they haven't also noticed what Ramsey got wrong and done it got right, that the resulting causal error need not point exclusively to the future. Okay, well, setting aside that last point, here's what I think we get from Ramsey. I think he offers us the beginnings of an answer to the two big puzzles about causation that we identified earlier. The first of these is Field's issue. Ramsey shows us how to reconcile Cartwright with Russell without hyperrealism. Ramsey's special agent gives us the distinction Cartwright shows us that we need between probabilistic dependencies encoded in the objective laws of association and those that survive from the point of view of the deliberating agent. The second thing he gives us is a story about the direction of causation. The difference between cause and effect is accounted for in terms of what we can manipulate to do what, and the prevailing temporal orientation of this causal error is then explained in terms of a contingent asymmetry in us, the fact that we deliberate past the future, as we put it. And the upshot is a picture in which Russell comes off rather well. If Ramsey's right, then so too is Russell about the claim that causation is not as fundamental as many philosophers have traditionally thought. More on that in a minute, but first a word about counterfactuals. So where do counterfactuals fit in this kind of picture? A couple of pages earlier in General Propositions and Causality, the paper we've been looking at, Ramsey has this to say about the kind of conditional judgments we need in practical deliberation. He says, when we deliberate about a possible action, we ask ourselves, what will happen if we do this or that? We give a definite answer of the form, if I do P, Q will result. This can properly be regarded as a material implication or disjunction, either not P or Q. But it differs, of course, from any ordinary disjunction in that one of its members is not something of which we're trying to discover the truth, but something that's within our power to make true or false. So again, this is earlier in the paper, we have this idea of the special epistemic character of the agent's perspective, and he backs that up in the footnote you see down here. He says, it's possible to take one's future voluntary action as an intellectual problem. Shall I be able to keep it up? But only by dissociating one's future self, and only by stepping outside the role of the deliberator. And he says, our conduct is largely determined by these hypothetical beliefs. So in other words, Ramsey is claiming here that the kind of conditionals we need in deliberation are not counterfactuals, not claims about what would be the case had something been different. They're hypotheticals, claims about what is true if something is the case for a very special kind of something, propositions that can't be intellectual problems, as he puts it, because we take them to be within our power to make true or false. And I think that if Ramsey's right, then it means that we don't need counterfactuals, where many people have thought that we do need them, as a foundation for our theory of decision. Instead, we have the prospect that we might be able to explain talk of counterfactuals in terms of these simpler kinds of hypotheticals. And I think that something like that idea has been suggested by the psychologist Alison Gopnik. Her idea is that we can employ these deliberative skills not merely online when facing real choices, but also offline when facing imaginary choices. Or perhaps a better way to put it, when imagining that we are facing real choices. Counterfactuals are the price we pay for hypotheticals, as Gopnik puts it. They're a kind of byproduct of the hypotheticals we need in decision, combined with our faculty of imagination. Now again, I don't have time to explore this interesting idea here, and the point I want to make is simply that if it's correct, then it'll give us a satisfyingly Russelian account of counterfactuals, just as Ramsey's main proposal does for causation. Okay, so are there causes if Ramsey's right? I think the answer is yes, but they're not as much part of the furniture as we might have thought. Causation goes on the side of the secondary qualities, to use an analogy I explored in an early paper with Peter Menzies. As Richard Corrie and I noted in a recent collection, it's the one you see here, we can characterize this option in terms of Russell's own constitutional metaphor. In the political case, we can distinguish three views of political authority. The traditional monarchist at one extreme takes political authority to be vested in our rulers by God. If we reject that view, then we have two choices. There's the anarchist option of rejecting the notion of political authority altogether, or the milder Republican option, which agrees with the traditional monarchist that there is political authority, but sees it as a kind of social construct, a social creation vested in our rulers by us. By analogy, the Republican option exists in metaphysics too. Causal republicanism, as Corrie and I called it, is thus the view that although the notion of causation is useful, perhaps indispensable in our dealings with the world, it's a category provided neither by God nor by physics, but rather constructed by us. From this Republican standpoint, then, thinking of a limitivism about causality, the view there's really no such thing as the sole alternative to full-blown realism, is like thinking of anarchy as the sole alternative to the divine right of kings. And as I noted then, there's an issue about where we put Russell in this new terminology. Is he a causal anarchist or a causal Republican? I suggested earlier that we might see him, perhaps with Huw, as what now counts as a kind of armchair anarchist, happy to retain talk of causation and counterfactuals for ordinary purposes. And that's really the Republican option, or at least the reflective, clear-headed version of the Republican option, that wants to combine a full-blooded participation in ordinary ways of speaking with a detached, over-the-shoulder understanding of how we come to speak that way and how it might have been otherwise. Contingency, irony, and solidarity, in the words of another of my philosophical heroes. How is this news going to be taken by the market? It won't be a shock, presumably, to learn that market values reflect the subjective preferences we humans have for various possible ends and outcomes. All of this depends on the fact that we're creatures who operate under uncertainty. All our lives we are, in a sense, betting, as Ramsey puts it. What the Republican view of causation does is to extend the story to the case of creatures who are also agents. They intervene in the environments about which they hold such beliefs and preferences. Certainly it shows that causal and counterfactual talk would be unneeded for creatures who didn't do that. Intelligent trees, for example, as Donnet once put it. But that's no threat to the real estate market, obviously, unless the good and presently beleaguered folk of Manhattan become a whole lot more passive than they've pretended to be today. Okay, well, so much for causation. But when it occurred to me that I had the opportunity to celebrate the centenary on the notion of cause on this occasion, I was curious about what Russell had in mind on the other side of his famous line. Just what, in Russell's view, is the harm that the monarchy is erroneously thought not to do? Now, I assume that this would be a very easy curiosity to satisfy. So somewhere, presumably, Russell would have expressed his views about the monarchy at greater length as he expressed his views about so many things. But I searched in vain. Google searched in vain on my behalf. And eventually I wrote to Nicholas Griffin of the Russell Archives at McMaster, who's edited a huge amount of Russell's material and perhaps knows Russell's writings better than almost anybody. He told me that there was really nothing to find, not even in Russell's correspondence, so far as he knew. But he did suggest a context for Russell's remark. In 1910, Britain had concluded a considerable constitutional crisis, brought on by the Liberal government's determination to remove the veto power of the House of Lords. A crucial step had been the King's indication that he would support the government if necessary by creating a sufficient number of new Liberal peers to ensure passage of the bill through the Lords. And Russell himself would have been one of those new peers, apparently, in that counterfactual world. Professor Griffin suggested in the light of the King's support, some on the Liberal side of politics were inclined to say that the monarchy wasn't so bad after all, and that Russell may have just been taking the opportunity to indicate that he was made of sterner stuff. The old battle lines of the Russells remained unchanged, as it were. But even if that's right, it doesn't tell us what Russell thought that the harm in question actually was at that point in the nation's history, when, thanks in part to Russell's own ancestors, it had long been a crowned republic, as Tennyson put it, a fact reaffirmed and strengthened in the recent crisis. So is my centenary footnote to Russell's great paper. I want to finish by giving you my own view about this matter. In my view, there is a significant cost to modern constitutional monarchies that's remarkable, among other things, for the fact that although in one sense it's in plain sight, it goes unmentioned, apparently almost unnoticed. As you'll see, it is indeed a relic of a bygone age, whose significance is hidden from us by the sheer familiarity of the system of which it's a consequence, by the fact that a traditional picture holds us in its grip, as Wittgenstein might have put it. Moreover, while I'm not suggesting that this is what Russell actually had in mind, it is, as you'll see, something that he in particular would have had reason to have in mind. It resonates in several ways with significant aspects of his own life. And it also connects in a deep way with the themes I've been talking about so far. So in all senses then, it's an excellent fit. I can introduce the point that I have in mind by noting a difference of opinion with most of my Australian compatriots. A majority of Australians appear to favour an Australian republic, even though many of them actually voted against it when they had the chance a few years ago because they didn't like the particular model on offer. But the main reason given by such people is that Australia should have an Australian head of state rather than the British monarch. And while I don't disagree with that sentiment, I think it misses a much more powerful appeal to the nation's professed values. Australia's next head of state under present arrangements is a man whose affection for the country dates from 1966, when he was sent for a couple of terms to a boarding school there. So here he is on. Oh no, that's Russell. Here's the person I have in mind. On a gloomy day in January, being farewelled by his father at Heathrow, getting on the plane. And then here, just a few days later, looking much more cheerful, having discovered the benefits of Australian sunshine. Here he is a few months later, dropping in on the Australian Prime Minister with his grandmother, there as you can see. And this was all a formative experience for him, apparently. As he put it just recently, he said, if you want to develop character, go to Australia. going on to mention some of the character-building names he was called by his Australian schoolmates. Now, I mention this partly because I'm talking about monarchy, partly because I find it very easy to feel on the same wavelength as the Prince at this point, because I encountered those same character-building opportunities. I know about some of the same epithets. The very same year. I didn't, in fact, go to Australia when I was 18 months old, as Tim wrongly suggested in his kind remarks at the beginning. It was actually when I was 13 in 1966, and so I arrived in Australia, I think, just 3 weeks after Prince Charles left. So here I am helping my father with the packing before we left. We were going on a ship, this ship, and so we needed cabin trunks, as you can see. And here I am with the rest of my family, I think the following year, on holiday at some east-facing beach. Okay, so there's this sort of early commonality between my life and that of Prince Charles. Although our lives diverged quite markedly after that. So he came to Trinity, had a memorable gig in Wales in 1969, and has now served his country and the Commonwealth with considerable distinction for more than 40 years. I went to ANU, making the first of many choices that turned out to lead happily and rather astoundingly to the present occasion. Not quite a gig in Wales, perhaps, but memorable enough for me. But the particular difference I want to highlight is that in common with most of my generation in countries such as Britain and Australia, I made choices about what to do with my life, whereas he did not, to an unusual extent. significant as his life's work is, the boy you see on the left there did not have the opportunity to choose it or to volunteer for it in any meaningful sense. And that's why I disagree with most of my compatriots, Republicans and monarchists alike, about the issue of an Australian republic. They think that the question turns on the importance or otherwise of Australia's having an Australian head of state. I think that that's a trivial matter, a mere sideshow, compared to the principle that all young people should be allowed to choose for themselves what they want to do with their lives when they grow up. The professed Australian value I mentioned a moment ago is simply that of fairness, a fair go, as Australians say. It seems to me profoundly and manifestly unfair to select children by accident of birth for future public office, especially so, of course, for such an important symbolic and public office as this one. And hence entirely inappropriate that Australia's constitution should make us all party to a practice of doing so. Now, apart from the fact that Australians like to make a fuss about fairness in this way, there's nothing uniquely Australian about the point, of course. It applies with equal force in all the modern democratic monarchies, almost all of which, 8 in total, neglecting a few tiny principalities, are in Europe. So the 8 European countries in question, 3 Scandinavian countries, 3 Benelux countries, Spain and Britain, all actually care just as much about fairness as Australia does, of course. So it's an issue for all of them in just the same way. Now, it's easy to see why I think this point is Russellian in spirit. As is well known, Russell felt the constraints of his own childhood very deeply and was greatly relieved to escape them when he came of age. Later, when he himself became a father, Russell was a famous advocate of allowing children as much freedom as possible. And finally, of course, he was also a famous opponent of conscription. That's why he was thrown out of Trinity. Now, it would be a little extreme perhaps to compare hereditary monarchy to conscription. A more neutral term might be involuntary service or involuntary servitude, as prohibited by the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. In that case, the US Supreme Court apparently later ruled that the amendment did not prohibit service properly rendered to the state, such as military conscription or jury duty. But as those cases make clear, it would be unthinkable that both these exclusions might be lifetime matters or apply to individuals chosen in infancy, presumably. And it would be unthinkable in any other advanced democracy too, if we were starting from scratch. If someone proposed that we should fill public offices by selecting infants who would then be brought up to fill the roles in question, the main objection would not be that it was undemocratic, but that it was absurdly unfair to the individuals concerned. The fact that we do find this system thinkable in practice turns mainly on its sheer familiarity. That's just how things are done. And perhaps, as Russell thinks in the case of causation, we're still in the grip of a piece of bad metaphysics. We think of royalty as a kind of natural kind, and hence imagine that it's a natural matter that royal children should be brought up to play these roles. That's just the kind of beings they are, as it were. The picture holds us captive, and central to it is the fantasy that what these families enjoy is a matter of entitlement and privilege, not constraint and obligation. It's easy to see how we got to this point from the distant past this picture actually depicts. On the one hand, a great erosion of power on the side of royalty, as, thanks in part to Russell's own ancestors, in the British case, its powers were curtailed. On the other hand, an even greater expansion of opportunity on the side of ordinary people, especially ordinary children, as we've come to accept that young people should make their life choices for themselves rather than have them dictated by parents or accidents of birth. The combination of these two factors means that the heirs to modern monarchies in Europe are now marooned on a little island of underprivilege, impoverished not only compared to their own ancestors, but also, much more importantly, compared to the standards that now exist in the community at large. And here the point connects back to the main themes of my lecture, and indeed of Russell's, broadly interpreted. For what precisely is it that these individuals lack compared to their contemporaries? Of what are they deprived? Essentially, it's counterfactuals. They're deprived of counterfactuals, of opportunities to make decisions about their lives on the large scale, in much the same way that New Jersey is deprived compared to Manhattan, even without a hurricane, about admittedly more trivial matters, to return to Frodo's observation about the real estate market. So here the two sides of Russell's famous metaphor come together. The reason we need to be at most armchair anarchists about causation and counterfactuals turns in part on the roles these notions play in human life, and particularly in our conception of a rich human life, a life with choices, a life with counterfactuals. It would be unthinkable, probably impossible, to live life without them, even if they were not fundamental, and play no role in fundamental physics, suitably construed. And on the other side, the great flaw of modern hereditary monarchies lies in the way in which they deprive a few individuals of some of these freedoms. This flaw has precisely the character suggested by Russell's comparison, a significant harm in plain sight, to which we are blinded by familiarity and bad metaphysics. So, with some renovation then, new foundations provided by Ramsey on the side of causation, and a sympathetic addition of a whole new wing that Russell himself did not construct on the side of the monarchy, Russell's edifice turns out to be in remarkably good shape on the eve of its 100th birthday. At least that's my view, and there's some evidence that it's the view on the street as well, at least here in New York. Please join me in wishing Russell's paper a happy 100th birthday.